The fire had already consumed the east wing when Lady Eleanor Ashford ran back inside. The servants screamed her name. The Duke of Winterbourne stood frozen in the courtyard, his face carved from stone as he watched his wife disappear into the flames. Not for him, never for him, but for the two children trapped on the third floor. His children, the ones he had sworn, on their wedding night 3 years ago, that he would never allow her to mother. "I want no heirs from you," he had said, his voice cold as winter frost. "You will have your title, your position, your comfort. But my children belong to their mother's memory. You are nothing to them. You will never be anything to them." Eleanor had not argued. She had simply nodded, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes dry. She had known what this marriage was when she accepted it. A transaction. An alliance. Her ruined family name was exchanged for his desperate need for respectability after scandal had nearly destroyed his late wife's reputation. But now, as flames licked the manor's ancient stones and smoke billowed black against the October sky, Eleanor had made a different choice entirely. She had run toward the screams of 6-year-old Charlotte and 4-year-old James, not away from them. And Adrian Blackwood, the Duke of Winterbourne, the man who had locked his heart in ice for 3 years, felt something crack inside his chest. Something that felt terrifyingly like fear. 3 years earlier, London, the height of the season. Eleanor Ashford had been the most pitied woman in London society, and she knew it. At 23, she should have been married years ago. Instead, she sat in drawing rooms while matrons whispered behind fans, while debutantes looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they were not her. The Ashford scandal had been spectacular even by Tun's standards. Her father, the Earl of Ashford, had gambled away the family fortune. Not discreetly, not over years, but in one catastrophic night at a hell in 7 dials. The debts were staggering. The creditors were ruthless. And when the Earl had put a pistol to his head rather than face the consequences, he had left behind a widow, 3 daughters, and ruins. Eleanor, as the eldest, had understood immediately what was required. She would marry, quickly, to anyone who would have her. Someone who needed something she could offer, a name, perhaps, or connections, or simply the appearance of respectability. The Duke of Winterbourne needed exactly that. Adrian Blackwood had been widowed 2 years prior. His wife, Catherine, had died in childbirth with their 3rd child, a son who had lived only 3 days. The circumstances surrounding her death had been whispered about in the darkest corners of society. There had been a physician, young and handsome, who had attended her during her confinement. There had been letters found after her death. Letters that suggested impropriety. Nothing proven. Nothing definite. But enough to stain. The Duke had retreated to Winterbourne Manor in Northumberland with his 2 surviving children and had not returned to London for 2 years. When he finally did, it was with a specific purpose: to find a wife who would give him back his standing in society, who would be above reproach, who would ask nothing of him emotionally. Lady Eleanor Ashford, desperate and practical, was perfect. Their courtship lasted 3 weeks. It consisted of 5 formal meetings, always chaperoned, always brief. They discussed settlements, expectations, and boundaries with the cold efficiency of solicitors drawing up a contract. "I will provide for you and your family," Adrian had said during their 4th meeting, his gray eyes as expressionless as winter fog. "Your mother and sisters will have dowries, a house in Bath. You will have everything a duchess could want, except my affection." That died with Catherine. Eleanor had met his gaze without flinching. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace. I require only security for my family. Nothing more. And the children," he had continued, his voice hardening. "Charlotte and James are Catherine's. I will not have them confused or hurt by a replacement mother. You will be civil to them, of course, but distant. They have a nurse, a governess. They need nothing from you. As you wish." He had studied her for a long moment, searching for signs of resentment or wounded pride. He found none. Lady Eleanor Ashford's face was a mask of perfect composure. "Good," he finally said. "Then we understand each other." They were married 4 weeks later in a small ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square. Eleanor wore gray silk, not white. Adrian's children did not attend. The reception was brief and formal. Their wedding night was even briefer. Adrian came to her room as duty required. He was not cruel, not rough. But he was distant, performing an obligation with cold efficiency. When it was done, he had risen, dressed, and paused at the door. "I want no heirs from you," he had said, not looking at her. "Catherine gave me 2 children. That is enough. You will have your own rooms, your own life. I will not trouble you again in this manner." Eleanor had pulled the sheets up to her chin, her body still trembling slightly. "I understand, Your Grace." "Adrian," he had said, surprising her. "In private you may call me Adrian. We are married, after all." Then he left, and for 3 years he had kept his word. He was civil, distant, and correct. He provided everything material. He asked nothing personal. He treated Eleanor exactly as he might treat a particularly competent housekeeper, with respect for her efficiency and absolutely no interest in her heart. Eleanor, for her part, had accepted her role with quiet dignity. She managed the household. She hosted dinners when required. She was everything a duchess should be: elegant, proper, and invisible. And she watched Adrian's children from a distance, never approaching, never offering affection they had been taught not to want from her, until the day she realized she loved them anyway. It began with small, stolen moments. Eleanor would pass the nursery and hear Charlotte's laughter. She would see James in the garden, his small face serious as he examined beetles. She would watch them at dinner on the rare occasions Adrian allowed them to join the adults, noting Charlotte's carefully perfect manners and James's tendency to swing his legs under the table when he thought no one was looking. She was not supposed to care. She had promised not to care. But Eleanor had always been terrible at keeping promises to herself. 6 months into the marriage, she made her first transgression. Charlotte had been crying in the library. Eleanor heard it while passing soft, muffled sobs that the 6-year-old was clearly trying to hide. The governess was nowhere in sight. Eleanor knew she should walk on, should summon Miss Pemberton, should not interfere. Instead, she opened the door. Charlotte sat curled in the window seat, her face pressed against her knees, her small shoulders shaking. She looked up when Eleanor entered, her eyes widening with something like fear. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Charlotte said immediately, scrubbing at her face. "I did not mean to disturb anyone. I will go at once." The formality in that little voice, the terror of being a burden, broke something in Eleanor's carefully maintained composure. "You're not disturbing anyone, Charlotte?" Eleanor said gently, moving closer. "May I sit with you?" Charlotte hesitated, clearly uncertain of the rules. She glanced toward the door as if expecting Miss Pemberton or her father to appear and forbid it. When no one came, she nodded slowly. Eleanor sat at the other end of the window seat, maintaining a respectful distance. She did not reach out, did not touch. She simply sat. "Would you like to tell me what's wrong?" Eleanor asked softly. "I'm not supposed to cry," Charlotte whispered. "Papa says Mama was always brave. I should be brave too." Eleanor's heart clenched. Sometimes being brave means knowing when to cry. Charlotte looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time. "Do you cry?" "Sometimes." "When?" Eleanor considered lying, then decided against it. "When I miss my father. When I'm lonely. When I'm afraid." "You're afraid?" Charlotte sounded shocked. "But you're a duchess. Duchesses can be afraid too." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Charlotte said, very quietly, "I miss my mama." "Of course you do. Papa won't talk about her. He says it's better to be strong." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "Your papa loved your mama very much. Sometimes when people love someone and lose them, the pain is so great they don't know how to speak about it without breaking. It's not that he doesn't want to remember her. It's that remembering hurts too much." Charlotte absorbed this, her small face thoughtful. "Do you think Mama would like you?" The question startled Eleanor. I don't know. I think she would," Charlotte said with the certainty of childhood. "You're kind. Mama was kind too." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened. Miss Pemberton entered, her face tightening when she saw them together. "Lady Charlotte, there you are. It's time for your French lesson." Charlotte slid off the window seat obediently. But at the door, she paused and looked back at Eleanor. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Eleanor." Eleanor found herself saying, "You may call me Eleanor, if you'd like." Charlotte's smile was small but genuine. Then she was gone. Eleanor remained in the window seat for a long time after, staring at nothing, knowing she had just crossed a line she could not uncross. Miss Pemberton, of course, reported the incident to the Duke. That evening, Adrian summoned Eleanor to his study. She went expecting coldness, perhaps anger. What she found was something more complex, confusion mixed with wariness. "Miss Pemberton tells me you spent time with Charlotte this afternoon," Adrian said without preamble. He stood behind his desk, his posture rigid. "I did. She was upset. The governess is perfectly capable of handling such matters." The governess was not there. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Nevertheless, I thought I made myself clear regarding the children." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "You did. You want me to be distant, civil but uninvolved." "Yes. And if I find a child crying alone, I'm to walk away? You're to summon the appropriate staff." "She's 6 years old, Adrian." It was the first time she had used his given name since their wedding night. He noticed. His eyes flickered with something. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance. "She has people to care for her." "She has servants," Eleanor corrected gently. "That's not the same thing. It's what I've decided is best." Eleanor took a step closer to the desk. She was not angry, but there was a firmness in her voice that had not been there before. "You married me to be your duchess, to manage your household, to restore your reputation. I have done all of that without complaint. But you cannot ask me to be inhuman. You cannot ask me to see a child in pain and do nothing. I'm not asking you to do nothing. I'm asking you not to confuse her about your role." "My role," Eleanor repeated. "And what role is that, precisely? I'm her father's wife, but not her stepmother? I live in this house, but I'm not part of the family? I exist, but I don't matter." Adrian's expression shuddered. "You matter. Your position matters. That's why I married you. But not to them. The children. I'm not to matter to them." "No." The single word fell like a stone. Eleanor stood very still. Then she nodded slowly. "I understand. You've made yourself perfectly clear." Again. She turned to leave. "Eleanor." She paused at the door but did not turn around. "This isn't personal," Adrian said, and for the first time, his voice held something other than coldness, something that might have been regret. "I'm protecting them. They've lost one mother. I won't let them lose another when this arrangement inevitably fails." Eleanor looked back at him then. "When it fails? Or when will you end it?" Adrian said nothing. Eleanor left, but she did not stop. The next time James fell and scraped his knee in the garden, Eleanor was there with clean clothes and gentle words. When Charlotte had nightmares, Eleanor sat outside her door until the sobbing stopped. When the children rode their ponies, Eleanor watched from the terrace, memorizing their laughter. She was careful. She never overstepped in Adrian's presence. She never contradicted Miss Pemberton. She never made herself obvious. But slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone who knows how to wait, Eleanor became part of the children's lives. And Adrian, watching from windows and doorways, told himself repeatedly that he should stop it. He never did. The shift happened in degrees so small they were almost invisible. It was Charlotte, mostly, who bridged the gap. At 7 years old, she possessed her father's intelligence and her late mother's warmth, a combination that made her both observant and determined. She had decided, with the absolutism of childhood, that she liked Eleanor. And Charlotte, once decided, was immovable. She began finding excuses to be where Eleanor was. If Eleanor read in the morning room, Charlotte would appear with her own book. If Eleanor walked in the garden, Charlotte would ask Miss Pemberton if she might take her constitutional at the same time. These encounters were always brief, always proper. They would exchange pleasantries, perhaps discuss Charlotte's lessons or the weather. Then Charlotte would return to the nursery, and Eleanor would continue her walk. But each encounter left Eleanor with a warmth she had not felt in years. James was more cautious. At 5, he remembered his mother only in fragments. A scent, a song, the feeling of being held. He watched Eleanor with solemn dark eyes, assessing, uncertain. One afternoon in the stables, he made his decision. Eleanor had gone to check on her mare. A gentle gray Adrian had given her as a wedding present, the only gift that had felt personal. She was stroking the horse's nose when James appeared, clutching a wooden soldier. "That's Artemis," James said, nodding toward the mare. "Yes, she's pretty." "She is." James moved closer, peering into the stall. "Papa says Mama had a horse like that. A gray mare. She died when Mama died." Eleanor's hand stilled on the horse's neck. "I'm sorry. That must have been very hard." "I don't remember much," James said, his voice small. "Charlotte remembers. She tells me stories about Mama. But sometimes I think she makes up bits to make me feel better. That's what big sisters do." James looked up at her. "Do you have sisters?" "I do. 2 younger sisters." "Do you tell them stories?" "I used to, before I came here." "Why don't you anymore?" Eleanor knelt down to James's level, mindful not to crowd him. "They live in Bath now with my mother. I don't see them very often." James absorbed this seriously. "Do you miss them?" "Every day. I'd miss Charlotte if she went away." He paused, then held out the wooden soldier. "This is Captain Winters. He's very brave. Would you like to hold him?" Eleanor understood the weight of what was being offered. She accepted the soldier with appropriate reverence. "He looks very brave indeed. Papa gave him to me before Mama died. Charlotte says Mama picked him out. Then he must be special." James nodded. Then, with the sudden decisiveness of childhood, he said, "You can visit him sometimes if you like. Captain Winters, he lives in the nursery." "I would be honored." James smiled, quick and bright and gone in an instant. Then he took Captain Winters back and ran off toward the house, leaving Eleanor kneeling in the stable aisle with her heart full of something dangerously close to love. Adrian noticed the changes, of course. He noticed everything about Eleanor, though he told himself it was merely the vigilance of a man protecting his household. He noticed that Charlotte laughed more often, that James's nightmares decreased, that both children seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by grief that was too heavy for such small shoulders. He noticed that Eleanor never overstepped. She did not contradict Miss Pemberton. She did not undermine his authority. She simply existed in the children's orbit, steady and warm as sunlight. It troubled him more than he wanted to admit. One evening, he found Charlotte showing Eleanor her watercolors in the drawing room. They were seated on the floor, which was decidedly improper, surrounded by papers covered in bright, messy flowers. "This one is a rose," Charlotte was saying seriously. "It's supposed to be pink, but I made it a bit purple by accident. Miss Pemberton says I must be more careful with my colors." "I think it's perfect," Eleanor said. "Purple roses would be quite exotic." "That's what I said." Charlotte beamed. "But Miss Pemberton says there's no such thing." "Actually," Adrian found himself saying from the doorway, "there are purple roses. They're called Cardinal de Richelieu. They were very popular in France." Both Eleanor and Charlotte turned to look at him. Charlotte with surprise, Eleanor with that careful neutrality she had perfected. "Really, Papa?" Charlotte scrambled to her feet. "You know about flowers?" "I know about many things," Adrian said, stepping into the room with measured casualness. He did not quite know why he had spoken. The words had simply emerged. "Did Mama like purple roses?" Charlotte asked. Adrian hesitated. Catherine had preferred white roses, traditional, elegant, proper. But he found himself saying, "Your Mama liked all flowers. She believed every bloom had its own beauty." Charlotte seemed to glow with this small revelation. "I shall paint more purple roses, then. For Mama." She gathered her papers carefully, and then, before Adrian could prepare himself, she kissed Eleanor's cheek. Thank you for looking at my paintings, Eleanor. Then she was gone, leaving Adrian and Eleanor alone in the drawing room. The silence stretched, not quite comfortable, not quite hostile. I apologize, Eleanor said, rising gracefully. I should have maintained more proper decorum. Miss Pemberton would be horrified to see Charlotte sitting on the floor. Miss Pemberton is not here. No, but… Eleanor. Adrian stopped her before she could leave. Charlotte seems happier. Eleanor turned slowly. Does that displease you? No. The admission cost him something. No, it doesn't. Then what does? Adrian moved to the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in the military stance he adopted when uncertain. When I married you, I believed I had erected sufficient boundaries, sufficient protections. For them. For myself. And now I find those boundaries have become permeable without my noticing when or how. Eleanor remained silent, letting him work through whatever he needed to say. The children have become attached to you, Adrian continued, his voice strained. I did not intend for that to happen. Would you like me to stop? Eleanor asked quietly. I will, if you command it. I will return to being nothing but civil and distant. Adrian turned to face her then. In the lamplight, she looked smaller than usual, vulnerable in a way she rarely showed. Her hands were clasped tightly at her waist, knuckles white with tension. She was preparing to lose them, he realized. Preparing to step back into the cold emptiness of their arrangement. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like a loss. No, he heard himself say. No, don't stop. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. They need. Adrian struggled for words. For honesty he had not allowed himself in years. They need more than I can give them. I love them, but I don't know how to. Catherine was warm, demonstrative. I am not. I've tried to be both a mother and a father both, but I'm failing at the former. You're not failing them, Eleanor said softly. I'm not succeeding. Adrian's jaw tightened. And you are. Without trying, without even wanting to initially, you're succeeding where I cannot. Adrian, let me finish. He drew a breath. What I'm trying to say, badly, is that I am grateful for what you've done, for what you are to them. I know I have no right to be grateful when I forbid it, when I pushed you away, but I am. Eleanor moved closer, not quite touching, but near enough that Adrian could smell her lavender soap. You're not pushing me away now. No. His voice dropped. I'm not. I should be. It would be safer. But I'm not. Safer for whom? He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because the truth was too dangerous. Safer for him. Safer for his carefully guarded heart. Eleanor seemed to understand anyway. She always seemed to understand things he didn't say. Charlotte asked me today if I thought her mama would like her purple roses, Eleanor said softly. I told her I believed her mama would love anything Charlotte created. That was the right answer. I also told her that her mama was watching from heaven and was very proud of her. Adrian's throat tightened. I will never try to replace Catherine, Eleanor continued. She was their mother. She will always be their mother. But if you'll allow it, if they want it, I would like to be something. Someone who loves them. Who they can come to when they're frightened or hurt or simply need someone who isn't a governess. A second mother, Adrian said. If they'll have me. He studied her face. The honesty there, the vulnerability, the quiet strength. Eleanor Ashford had been thrust into an impossible situation and had navigated it with more grace than he'd had any right to expect. I think, Adrian said slowly, they already do have you, and I think Catherine would approve. It was the first time he'd spoken his late wife's name to Eleanor without pain. The first time he'd allowed the possibility that Catherine's memory and Eleanor's presence could coexist. Eleanor's eyes grew bright. Thank you. Adrian nodded, unable to trust his voice further. Then, because he still didn't know how to be anything but formal, he excused himself and left. But the boundaries had shifted irrevocably. And in the months that followed, they continued to shift. It was Charlotte who started calling her Mama Eleanor. James, always more careful, used Eleanor in his father's presence and Mama, when they were alone, as if testing whether he was allowed such affection. Eleanor treasured both versions equally. Dinners became family affairs. Adrian found himself lingering after the children went to bed, discussing James's progress with his pony or Charlotte's talent for watercolors. These conversations would drift to estate business, to politics, to books they'd both read. Adrian discovered that Eleanor had opinions. Sharp ones. She read newspapers and discussed parliamentary matters with the intelligence of someone who actually understood policy. She could debate the corn laws with the same ease she managed household accounts. It was unsettling and fascinating. One night, after a particularly spirited discussion about Catholic emancipation, Adrian caught himself smiling. It had been 3 years since he'd smiled genuinely. Since Catherine's death, smiles had been performances, social obligations fulfilled with the minimum required effort. This was different. This was real. Eleanor noticed. "What?" "Nothing," Adrian said quickly. Then, because dishonesty seemed suddenly impossible, "I was just thinking that you're not what I expected." "Is that a compliment?" "I believe it might be." Eleanor laughed. A genuine, unguarded sound he'd never heard from her. "Then I shall accept it as one." The ease between them should have felt dangerous. Instead, it felt natural, as if this had been waiting beneath the cold formality all along. But Adrian told himself it was friendship, partnership, nothing more. He continued telling himself that even as he found excuses to seek Eleanor's company, even as he noticed the way candlelight caught in her dark hair, even as her laugh became the sound he most wanted to hear, he was still telling himself that on the day his world caught fire. It began with Mrs. Halloway's candle. The housekeeper had gone to inspect the East Wing storage rooms, unused chambers filled with old furniture, trunks of clothing from previous generations, the accumulated possessions of a family that had occupied Winterbourne Manor for 2 centuries. She'd taken a candle. Old habit. The wing had no gas lighting yet. What she hadn't known was that James had been playing there that afternoon. He'd built a fort from old curtains, draping them dramatically from furniture to furniture, creating a fabric maze for his imaginary battles. When Mrs. Halloway's candle tipped, whether from a draught or her own carelessness would never be determined, it fell directly onto those old, dry curtains. The fire spread with horrifying speed. By the time the smoke was noticed, the East Wing was already consumed. Servants ran with buckets. Adrian shouted orders, organizing a chain from the well to the house. But the fire had too much fuel, too much air. "Where are the children?" Adrian's voice cut through the chaos. Miss Pemberton appeared, her face gray with terror. "They were in the nursery, Your Grace. I stepped out for only a moment." "The nursery?" Adrian's blood turned to ice. The nursery was in the East Wing, 3rd floor. The wing that was burning. "You left them alone?" "Only for a moment, I swear." Adrian was already running. He made it as far as the entrance to the East Wing before the smoke drove him back, choking, his eyes streaming. The heat was tremendous. The stairs were already engulfed. "Your Grace, you can't." Grimshaw, the butler, grabbed his arm. "The stairs won't hold. The wing will collapse. My children are in there. We'll find another way, Will." "There is no other way." Adrian's voice broke on something that might have been a sob. "Charlotte, James." He could hear them, faintly, through the roar of flames and cracking wood, children's voices crying for help. Adrian tried again to enter, and again the smoke and heat drove him back. His strength, his title, his wealth, all of it meaningless. He couldn't reach them. He couldn't save them. He was going to lose his children the way he'd lost Catherine, helplessly, uselessly, while life mocked him with his powerlessness. "Papa!" Charlotte's voice, thin with terror. Adrian fell to his knees in the courtyard, smoke-stained and broken. And then Eleanor was there. She appeared from the garden side of the house, where she'd been cutting roses for the dining table. She took in the scene instantly. The burning wing, Adrian on his knees, the servants' terrified faces. "Where are Charlotte and James?" "3rd floor," Adrian gasped. "East Wing. The stairs." He didn't finish. Eleanor was already moving. Lady Eleanor, no? Mrs. Halloway shrieked. Eleanor ignored her. She ran to the exterior of the east wing, looking up at the windows. 3 stories. Too high, but there was ivy, ancient and thick, climbing the stone walls. Adrian scrambled to his feet. Eleanor, don't. She had already begun to climb. The world stopped. Adrian watched, unable to breathe, as his wife climbed the exterior of a burning building. The ivy held barely. Her skirts caught on branches. Her hands slipped on the stone. But she kept climbing with a determination that bordered on fury. She was halfway up when the window above her exploded outward from the heat. Glass rained down. Eleanor pressed herself flat against the wall, turned her face away. Then she kept climbing. She's mad, someone whispered. She'll die, someone else said. Adrian said nothing. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only watch as Eleanor reached the 3rd-floor window. Not the nursery, but the schoolroom adjacent, and smashed the remaining glass with her elbow. She disappeared inside. 30 seconds passed. A lifetime. Then Eleanor reappeared at the window with Charlotte in her arms. Catch her! Eleanor's voice rang out over the chaos. Adrian positioned himself below, arms outstretched. Drop her! Eleanor didn't hesitate. She lowered Charlotte as far as she could, then let go. Adrian caught his daughter with a force that drove him to his knees. Charlotte was coughing, crying, terrified but alive. James! Charlotte sobbed. James is still inside. Adrian looked up. Eleanor had already disappeared back into the smoke. No, Adrian breathed. Eleanor. No. Leave him. Save yourself. But she was already gone. The seconds stretched into eternity. Smoke poured from the window. Adrian could hear the structure groaning, about to collapse. Please. Adrian whispered to no god in particular, to every god simultaneously. Please. And then Eleanor reappeared with James, unconscious, limp in her arms. She didn't try to lower him. There was no time. The floor beneath her was giving way. Adrian could see it through the window. Flames licking up the walls behind her, the boards blackening and cracking. Eleanor stepped onto the windowsill with James in her arms. Trust me, she shouted down to Adrian. Then she jumped. She should have killed them both. 3 stories carrying a child. But Eleanor twisted in midair, landing on the thick hedge below at an angle that absorbed most of the impact. Adrian reached them in seconds. Eleanor was gasping, bleeding from a dozen cuts, her dress scorched and torn. But James was breathing. Is he? Eleanor couldn't finish. He's alive? Adrian confirmed, his hands shaking as he checked his son. You saved him. You saved both of them. The east wing collapsed then with a roar of timber and flame. If they had waited even a few more seconds, Adrian gathered James in one arm and helped Eleanor to her feet with the other. She swayed, and he realized she'd broken something. Her ankle, perhaps, or several ribs. I can't walk, Eleanor said faintly. Then I'll carry you. Adrian swept her up despite her protest, James still in her arms. He carried them both away from the fire, toward safety, toward the gathered servants who were staring at Eleanor as if she'd descended from heaven wrapped in flames. Charlotte ran to them, throwing her arms around Eleanor's waist. You came for us. You came even when Papa couldn't. Eleanor touched the girl's hair with a trembling hand. Of course I came. Of course. Adrian lowered Eleanor gently to the grass well away from the fire. The physician had already been sent for. Servants brought blankets, water. But Adrian couldn't move. He knelt beside Eleanor, one hand on James's small chest to feel his breathing, the other still supporting Eleanor's shoulders. You could have died, he said, and his voice cracked completely. Eleanor, you could have died. So could they. Eleanor's eyes were fierce despite her pain. I wasn't going to let that happen. I forbade you to be their mother. I locked you out. I was cruel. And yet you. They're children, Adrian. Eleanor's voice softened. I don't care what you forbade or what our arrangement was. They're children and I love them. I have loved them for months, perhaps from the very beginning. I would have burned for them if I had to. Adrian stared at her. This woman he'd married as a convenience, kept at arm's length, underestimated completely. She was covered in soot and blood, her hair singed, her clothes ruined. She'd never looked more beautiful. I was wrong, Adrian said. The words pulled from someplace deep and unguarded. About everything. About you. About what you mean to them. About. James stirred, coughing. His eyes fluttered open. Mama? He said, looking at Eleanor. Not Eleanor. Not even Mama Eleanor. Just Mama. Eleanor's face crumpled. She gathered James closer, pressing her face to his hair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Adrian closed his eyes, the last of his carefully constructed walls crumbling to ash. He had tried for 3 years to keep Eleanor at a distance, to preserve Catherine's memory by refusing to let anyone else matter. What a fool he had been. What a profound, catastrophic fool. The physician confirmed Eleanor's injuries. A broken rib, a sprained ankle, burns on her hands and arms, and smoke damage to her lungs. She would need weeks to recover. Months, perhaps, to fully heal. She would bear the scars forever. You're fortunate to be alive, Your Grace, Dr. Matthews said soberly. What you did was extraordinarily dangerous. I know. Then why? Because they're my children, Eleanor said simply. Wouldn't you do the same? Dr. Matthews had no answer for that. Adrian sat with Eleanor that night. She'd been installed in the ducal suite. His suite, the rooms she'd never been invited to occupy during their marriage. The children were in the adjacent chamber, both sleeping under the watchful eye of a maid. Miss Pemberton had been dismissed. Adrian had done it quietly, with a generous settlement, but the woman would never work in a noble household again. That kind of negligence could not be forgiven. Eleanor lay propped against pillows, her hands bandaged, breathing carefully to avoid jarring her rib. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were alert when Adrian entered. You should be sleeping, Adrian said. So should you. He sat in the chair beside her bed, the same chair he'd occupied during Catherine's final illness. The parallel was not lost on him, and it sent a cold spike of fear through his chest. How are you really? He asked. Sore, but alive. Eleanor studied his face. How are you? Adrian let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so broken. You nearly died saving my children, and you're asking how I am? You looked rather devastated when I jumped. Rather devastated, Adrian repeated. Eleanor, I watched you climb a burning building and leap from a 3rd-story window. Rather devastated is a considerable understatement. The hedge broke my fall. You broke your ankle. Better my ankle than my neck. Eleanor's attempt at levity fell flat. Adrian leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. When I saw you disappear into that smoke, I thought. He couldn't finish. You thought you were going to lose another wife. I thought I was going to lose the only person who has made me feel alive in 3 years. The confession came out raw, unplanned. Eleanor went very still. Adrian looked up, met her eyes. I have been a coward. For 3 years, I have hidden behind grief and duty and the excuse that I was protecting my children. But I wasn't protecting them. I was protecting myself. From what? From this. Adrian gestured between them. From feeling anything for you. From letting you matter. Because if you mattered, I could lose you. And I couldn't. His voice broke. I watched Catherine die, Eleanor. I held her hand while life bled out of her, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing. I was helpless and useless. And when it was over, I swore I would never let anyone matter that much again. So you locked everyone out? Yes. Including your own children. Adrian flinched but nodded. I told myself I was being strong, that I was honoring Catherine by preserving her role, by not allowing anyone to replace her. But really, I was just afraid. Afraid of being hurt. Afraid of being helpless again. Eleanor reached out with her bandaged hand, wincing at the movement. Adrian took it gently. You're not helpless, Adrian. I was tonight. Couldn't reach them. I tried. And the smoke drove me back. And I was on my knees in the courtyard listening to my children scream while I did nothing. You organized the household. You tried to find another way. You found another way, Adrian interrupted. You climbed the wall. You went into the flames. You saved them when I could not. Because I wasn't thinking. I just acted. No. Adrian's grip tightened on her hand. You acted because you love them. Because in your heart they're already yours. You didn't hesitate because there was no question. Of course you would save them. Of course you would risk everything. Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks. Yes. I should have seen it sooner, Adrian said. Should have acknowledged what you'd become to them, to this household, to me. But I was too busy protecting my own cowardly heart to notice that you had already claimed theirs. And yours, Eleanor whispered. Have I claimed yours too? Adrian lifted her bandaged hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her palm through the cloth. You have held it since the moment I saw you disappear into those flames. Perhaps before. I don't know when it happened. I only know that when I thought I might lose you, I realized I had already lost my heart. Eleanor's breath hitched. I love you, Adrian said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. I love you, and I'm terrified because I'm not good at this. I'm not warm like Catherine was. I'm not easy with affection. I'm cold and controlled, and I hurt people without meaning to. Stop. Eleanor cupped his face with her unbandaged hand. You're not cold. You're careful. You've been hurt and you protect yourself. That doesn't make you unlovable. It makes you human. I don't deserve you. Probably not. Eleanor smiled through her tears. But you have me anyway. I loved you even when you tried to keep me at arm's length. I loved you even when you said you wanted nothing from me. I couldn't help it. Adrian closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to hers gently, mindful of her injuries. I want everything from you. Your laughter, your opinions, your infuriating tendency to question my decisions. I want breakfast conversations and evening walks and every small moment in between. I want you as my wife truly, not an arrangement, not a convenience. As my partner, my love, my choice. And the children are already yours. They have been for some time. I was just too stubborn to admit it. He pulled back slightly to meet her eyes. Charlotte calls you Mama. James does too when he thinks I won't hear. I want them to call you that always. I want them to know that the woman who ran into fire to save them is their mother in every way that matters. Catherine, I would want them to be loved, Adrian said firmly. She would want them to be happy. And you make them happy, Eleanor. You make them whole in ways I cannot. You make them whole too, perhaps. But together. Adrian paused, searching for words. Together we make them a family. A real one. The kind Catherine and I were building before we lost her. Eleanor was crying openly now. I'm afraid. Of what? Of letting myself believe this is real. That you truly want me, not just as a mother for your children, but as my wife, Adrian finished, as the woman I love, as my partner in every possible way. He leaned in, his lips hovering just above hers. Let me prove it to you. Let me spend the rest of my life proving it. Then he kissed her. It was nothing like their wedding night. Cold, perfunctory, dutiful. This was warmth and tenderness and promise. This was 3 years of denial finally crumbling into truth. Eleanor kissed him back despite her injuries, despite the pain, despite everything. Because this was what she'd wanted since before she could name the wanting. When they finally parted, Adrian rested his forehead against hers again. When you're healed, he murmured, I'm going to court you properly. Flowers, poetry, romantic gestures. All the things I should have done 3 years ago. I don't need grand gestures. You do. You deserve them. Adrian pulled back to look at her seriously. You deserve everything I didn't give you. Everything I was too afraid to offer. And I'm going to spend however long it takes making up for my cruelty. You weren't cruel. You were grieving. I was both. Adrian wouldn't let himself off easily. But I'm done grieving, Eleanor. I'm done hiding. I'm choosing to live again. With you. A soft sound from the adjacent room made them both turn. James appeared in the doorway, dragging a blanket, his small face worried. "I heard you talking," he said. "I wanted to make sure Mama was all right." Neither Adrian nor Eleanor corrected the title. "I'm all right, darling," Eleanor said, extending her uninjured hand. "Come here." James climbed carefully onto the bed, mindful of Eleanor's injuries. He curled against her side like a small animal seeking warmth. "You saved us," James whispered. "Charlotte told me. You climbed the wall and came into the fire." "Of course I did. Even though you could have died? Even though? Because you love us?" Eleanor's voice was thick with tears. "Because I love you more than anything in the world." James looked at his father. "Papa, you're not angry that she calls herself our mama?" Adrian moved to sit on the edge of the bed, his hand coming to rest on James's back. "No, son, I'm not angry. I'm grateful. Your mother in heaven will always be your mother." "But Eleanor." He looked at his wife with such open affection that Eleanor's breath caught. "Eleanor is your mother too. You're allowed to love both." "Good," James said simply. Then, with the shocking honesty of childhood, "I like having two mamas. One who watches from heaven and one who's here to hold me." Adrian's eyes burned. He gathered both James and Eleanor into his arms, carefully, so carefully, and held them. Charlotte appeared in the doorway moments later, drawn by the sound of voices. She took in the scene, her father holding both her brother and stepmother, all of them crying, and made a small, happy sound. "Does this mean Eleanor is really our mama now?" Charlotte asked, climbing onto the bed as well. "Not just in secret?" "Yes," Adrian said firmly. "She is your mama in every way that matters. If anyone asks, if anyone questions, you tell them that. Do you understand?" "Yes, Papa." Charlotte nestled against Eleanor's other side. "I'm glad. I've wanted to call her Mama for ages. But Miss Pemberton said it was improper." "Miss Pemberton is gone," Adrian said. "And from now on, proper is whatever this family decides it is." They stayed like that for a long time, the four of them tangled together on the bed, injured and smoke-stained and absolutely whole. This, Adrian thought, was what he should have had from the beginning. This warmth, this connection, this family. He'd nearly lost it through his own stubbornness and fear. Never again. Eleanor's recovery took weeks. Adrian rarely left her side except when the estate business absolutely demanded it. He read to her, brought her meals, carried her when she needed to move from one room to another. The children were constant visitors. Charlotte brought her watercolors to show Eleanor. James brought Captain Winters and narrated elaborate battles that usually ended with the brave captain saving a princess. The princess, Adrian noticed, always had brown hair like Eleanor. Slowly, Eleanor healed. The burns scarred, silvery marks on her hands and forearms that she would carry forever. The broken rib mended. The sprained ankle regained its strength. And through it all, Adrian courted her as he'd promised. He brought her roses, purple ones, like Charlotte's paintings. He read her poetry in the evenings. He took her on slow walks through the gardens, supporting her weight when her ankle tired. He talked to her about everything. His fears, his grief over Catherine, his guilt about how he'd treated Eleanor for 3 years. He held nothing back, gave her every broken piece of himself, and trusted her not to cut herself on the shards. Eleanor, for her part, did the same. She told him about the shame of her father's suicide, the desperation of being unmarriageable, the loneliness of their early marriage. "I used to lie awake at night," she admitted one evening as they sat in the garden, "wondering what I'd done to deserve such coldness, wondering if I was truly as forgettable as you seem to think." Adrian's hands tightened on hers. "I'm so sorry. I know. But I need you to understand. That hurts. It hurts every day. I know. And I can never undo it. But Eleanor." He turned to face her fully. "You were never forgettable. You were terrifying." Eleanor blinked. "Terrifying? You walked into my carefully ordered life and disrupted everything without even trying. You were competent, intelligent, and kind. You made my children smile. You made me feel things I'd sworn never to feel again." Adrian's voice roughened. So I told myself you didn't matter, that you were just a convenience. Because if you mattered, if I let you in, I would be vulnerable again. And vulnerability had already destroyed me once. And now I know that vulnerability is the price of love. And you are worth that price. You are worth any price. Eleanor kissed him then, soft and sweet in the gathering twilight. 3 months after the fire, Adrian made his announcement. He called the household together, all the servants, Charlotte and James and Eleanor, who was now fully healed and able to stand without assistance. I married Lady Eleanor 3 years ago, Adrian began, his voice carrying through the assembled crowd. It was a marriage of convenience, an arrangement that benefited both parties. I made that arrangement clear to everyone, to Eleanor, to this household, to my children. He paused, his eyes finding Eleanor's. I was wrong. A marriage is not an arrangement. It's a partnership, a choice. And for 3 years, I denied Eleanor that choice by refusing to see her as anything more than a duchess in name only. Charlotte and James exchanged confused glances. But Eleanor never accepted those terms, Adrian continued. Not really. She loved my children when I forbade it. She made this house a home when I wanted only cold efficiency. She risked her life to save Charlotte and James when I could not. His voice grew thick with emotion. She showed me what true courage looks like, what true love looks like. And she did it without asking for anything in return. Adrian crossed to Eleanor, took both her hands in his. So today I want to correct my mistakes. In front of everyone. He raised his voice so every servant could hear. Lady Eleanor is not merely a duchess in name. She is my wife in every sense. She is the mother of my children. Charlotte and James both call her Mama, and I encourage it. She is the mistress of this household, with full authority to make any decisions she sees fit. And most importantly, he lifted Eleanor's hand to his lips. She is the woman I love, wholly, completely, without reservation. And I want everyone to know it. The servants burst into applause. Charlotte and James cheered. Mrs. Halloway dabbed at her eyes with her apron. Eleanor was crying openly. You didn't have to do this, she whispered. Yes, I did, Adrian replied. I spent 3 years keeping you in the shadows. I will spend the rest of my life bringing you into the light. He kissed her in front of the entire household. Propriety be damned. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the newly rebuilt East Wing, now completely renovated with modern gas lighting and fireproof materials. It's beautiful, she said, running her hand along the new wallpaper. It had better be, Adrian replied from the doorway. Do you know what this renovation cost? I do. I approved all the expenditures. Exactly. You've made me a pauper. Eleanor laughed. They both knew the estate could afford it easily. Adrian moved to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. Do you ever regret it? He asked quietly. Regret what? Marrying me, accepting such terrible terms, enduring 3 years of coldness. Eleanor turned in his arms. Ask me that question in a different way. What? Ask me if I regret climbing that wall. If I regret saving Charlotte and James. If I regret staying when you pushed me away. If I regret loving you even when you tried to forbid it. Adrian understood. Do you? Not for a single moment. Eleanor cupped his face. You gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, Adrian. Family. Children to love. Purpose. You. I nearly lost you. But you didn't. I could have. If the floor had collapsed a moment earlier, if you'd fallen differently. But I didn't. Eleanor kissed him softly. We both survived. We all survived. And now we have this, a second chance. A real marriage. A real family. A real life, Adrian added. Yes. They stood together in the rebuilt wing, where destruction had given way to renewal, and Adrian marveled at the unlikely path that had brought them here. He'd married Eleanor Ashford to restore his reputation. He'd kept her at arm's length to protect his heart. He'd sworn she would never be a mother to his children. And in the end, she'd become all of those things anyway, Not because he'd allowed it, but because she'd chosen it. Choose them. Chosen love even when it was forbidden. "I want no heirs from you," Adrian had said on their wedding night. What a fool he'd been. 2 years later, the nursery in the renovated East Wing had become the heart of Winterbourne Manor. Charlotte, now 9, sat at the window seat with her watercolors, painting yet another purple rose. James, 7, sprawled on the floor with Captain Winters and an ever-growing army of toy soldiers. And in the cradle beside Eleanor's chair, twin girls slept peacefully, Catherine and Grace, born just 6 months prior. Adrian had wept when Eleanor told him she was pregnant. Not because he'd wanted heirs, though of course the succession was now secure, but because it meant Eleanor had given him yet another gift he hadn't deserved. "They have your eyes," he'd said when the twins were born, holding one daughter in each arm with the tenderness of someone who'd learned that strength and gentleness were not opposites. "And your stubborn chin," Eleanor had replied, exhausted and radiant. "God help us all." Now, Adrian watched his family from the doorway of the nursery and felt something that had been absent for so many years. Peace. Charlotte looked up from her painting. "Papa, come look. I finally got the color right." Adrian crossed the room, examined the purple rose carefully. "It's perfect." "Really? Really? Your mother," he paused. "Catherine, I mean, your first mama. She would have loved this." Charlotte smiled. "I know. I feel like she's watching sometimes. Like she's happy we found Eleanor." "I think she is." James looked up from his soldiers. "Papa, can Eleanor come play with us? She promised to be the captured princess today." "I believe Eleanor is feeding your sisters," Adrian replied. "We can wait," Charlotte said. "The best stories are worth waiting for." Adrian's throat tightened with emotion. "Yes, they are." That evening, after the children were asleep and the twins had been fed and settled, Eleanor and Adrian walked through the gardens. It was spring again, the season when they'd married 4 years ago, the season when everything had changed. "Are you happy?" Adrian asked, a question he'd grown comfortable asking. "Deliriously," Eleanor replied. "You, more than I ever thought possible." They walked in companionable silence for a while. Then Eleanor said, "I was thinking about our wedding day." "What about it?" "How young I was. How terrified. How I walked into that church knowing I was marrying a man who would never love me." Adrian winced. "Eleanor, let me finish." She stopped walking, turned to face him. "I was wrong. You did love me, eventually. And the journey to that love, the coldness, the distance, the fear, made this what we have now more precious. Because we both had to choose it. We both had to fight for it. You shouldn't have had to fight for basic kindness. Perhaps not. But I'm not sorry I did." Eleanor smiled. "Because now I know beyond any doubt that you love me. Not because you have to. Not because it's convenient. But because you chose to. You opened your heart even though it terrified you. You make it sound noble. I was just a coward who finally ran out of excuses. You were a wounded man who learned to heal." Eleanor took his hands. "And now you're teaching our children that it's all right to be afraid, as long as you don't let fear stop you from loving." Adrian pulled her close, breathed in the lavender scent of her hair. "I love you, Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Winterbourne. I love you more than words can express." "I know," Eleanor said. "You show me every day." They stood together in the garden as darkness fell, surrounded by roses, purple ones now, growing alongside the traditional white. A blending of past and present, of memory and new life. Charlotte had been right. Every bloom had its own beauty, and sometimes Adrian thought the most beautiful blooms grew from the ashes of what had been burned away. He'd sworn he wanted no heirs from Eleanor. What he'd gotten instead was a family, a love, a life he'd never imagined possible. And it had started the day she'd run into flames to save children he'd told her she could never call her own. "Thank you," Adrian whispered against Eleanor's hair. "For what?" "For refusing to accept my cruelty. For loving my children. For climbing that wall." He pulled back to meet her eyes. "For saving us all." Eleanor smiled, tears shining in the moonlight. You would have done the same for me. In a heartbeat. I know. She kissed him softly. That's how I know we're going to be all right. Whatever comes, whatever challenges, we'll face them together. Together, Adrian agreed. And as they walked back toward the house, toward the nursery where 4 children slept peacefully, toward the life they'd built from broken pieces, Adrian knew one truth with absolute certainty. He'd been given a second chance at love, at family, at life itself. And he would never, ever take it for granted again.